Yeah, I do a lot of research into pictogram design, and my main focus are more or less anonymous pictogram systems from transport associations. This one, however, is a different one. It's a known system, everyone knows it, and I'm interested in the historiography of this system. So I've been writing and reading a lot in the last few months, and I have two questions that I would like to talk about and like to answer for you. First of all, how were the Tokyo Olympic pictograms developed? It might seem like a simple question, but it's not really. Second of all, what was Katsumi's vision for the relay of symbols? RP already referred to this. Katsumi had the idea that the symbols should be reworked by future generations of designers to a more or less perfect model. Let's talk about Katsumi. Who was this guy? Katsumi was a Japanese design critic and design manager organizer. Born in 1909 in a higher middle class family, he became interested in art and design at a young age. Afterwards, he studied at the Tokyo Imperial University, art and aesthetics, literature. From the 1940s onwards, he worked for the government, he organized exhibitions, but in the 1950s, he also started a design journal, Graphic Design, a bilingual journal that contributed to making Japanese design better known in the Western world and the other way around. He had a clear view of the role of the design critic. He thought it should represent the public interest, the people. Finally, he was associated as a founding member or chairman with most Japanese design organizations, in total about 12 of them. So he was very active. And his wide network and knowledge made him into the ideal person to organize design events. And it's in this manner that he became chairman of the design committee for the Tokyo Olympics in 1960. But how is it that he became known as art director of the Tokyo Olympics visual identity? Our ideas about the development of the visual identity of the Tokyo Olympics depend heavily on Katsumi's own account in graphic design. He described the development of the Tokyo Olympics design policy, a term associated with the planned use of good design, not per se uniform design. And in addition, he mentioned the use of a visual language in regard to the systematic application of logo, typeface, color, and symbols. I must admit, his use of the word visual language is somewhat odd because usually logo, typeface, etc. is indicated with the words also at that time corporate image, corporate identity, or house style. Now, Katsumi suggested in his article that a clear design policy had been set out from the beginning. And that was not the case. In fact, the development of the visual presentation of the Tokyo Olympics was a transitionary process in which Katsumi and his colleagues moved from a good design policy to a partially realized visual identity. He rewrote the history a bit, and that is key in understanding how these pictograms developed. The design committee, of which he became chairman, was established in 1960, and it was originally established to manage the competition for the logo. It also had an advisory role to the Tokyo Olympics Organizing Committee, the TOOC. What does it mean? It recommended designers for official or prestigious items. Actually, most visual designs for the Tokyo Olympics were developed by the Nippon Design Center, the NDC. Between 1960 and 1962, it was led by Yosaki Kamakura, who we all know from the logo for the Olympics. From 1962 onwards, it was led by the typographer Hiromu Hara, who also is said to have given advice about the typography for the logo. In addition, Hiromu also designed diplomas, he designed the tickets, he designed the bulletin, the official invitation for the games. In fact, his name is the most used designer's name in the official report of the Olympic Games. So quite a crucial designer. Katsumi's role only became more prominent in the autumn of 1963. By that time, the Olympic sports facilities and villages, developed and managed by the so-called Facilities Committee, had almost been finished, and the need arose for systems of signs, decorations, and other details at the sites and surrounding environs. Rather than leaving it up to the design committee to advise on these matters, Katsumi was chosen to coordinate the design of the environmental graphics with the Facilities Committee. He received no budget, meaning pictograms were not planned, And that also meant he could not approach the NDC, the design center. But he did get a small space at the seat of the Tokyo Olympics organizing committee. Here he got a small space, and he attracted a range of young and talented designers to do the work for free, to design the banners, the symbols, and so onwards. Eventually, everything was described in a manual, which was in fact a manual for environmental graphics. Later, this has become more known as a manual for the whole identity, but actually it's quite limited. Now let's take a closer look at the development of facilities pictograms. These were developed in May-June 1964, quite close to the beginning of the games. And Katsumi, he selected 11 designers. According to a witness, they met in the workshop room and under the direction of Iko Tanaka drew sketches on A4s with blue markers for every item, such as toilet, telephone, and so onwards. Then the sketches were compared with each other by putting them on a wall and revised again and again. The final decision was carried out by Iko Tanaka. Of course, Katsumi in the end also let his view shine over the symbols, but it's likely that much of the quality control was also done by Tanaka. It was pioneering work. At the time, there were hardly examples of image concepts to use in pictograms. Typical for the hastily process is that the facility symbols were not always stylistically similar. Humans were depicted in different ways. By the way, what you see here are other pictograms. These are not part of the official set, but of course the pictograms were also used for plans for the facilities of athletes, service centers, etc. So the selection of the symbols that you see in the official set is likely a selection. It doesn't represent everything. Regardless of their quality, these symbols are the most influential set of pictograms ever produced for the Olympics or World Expositions. Almost 20% of the popular image contents in our current pictogram systems originates here. Now, the sports symbols. These were designed 2 years earlier by the illustrator Yoshiro Yamashita for use on the Olympic event tickets. He received the assignment in May 1962 when he was working at Nippon Design Center, the NDC. It's likely that Hiromu, the typographer you saw, oversaw the development of the sports symbols. Characteristic for them is the use of the head as a circle and the imaginative use of positive and negative space. Functionally, negative space indicated shirts and pants, whereas visually, it de-emphasized the trunk, with the limbs and their implied movements now attracting more attention. Sports symbols originated in tickets, and it's interesting to investigate these tickets a bit further because they tell us a lot about the rising need for wayfinding at the Olympic Games. Tickets moved through the hands of sellers, event visitors, turnstile attendants, and stewards, providing them with the information they needed to fulfill their aim or function. With the growing number of visitors, events, and venues, Olympic ticket design showed a gradual differentiation and optimization of visual aids to facilitate the handling and use. This started with the introduction in 1912 of a map on the back of the tickets at the Stockholm Olympics and progressed from the 1948 London Olympics, where I see here introduced the first sports symbols, with an ever greater range of symbols. With Helsinki, the time symbol was added as well. With Rome, the symbol could also be changed to a night or day symbol. And with Mexico, they totally went crazy and made symbols all over the place, from seating symbols, but also symbols on the map on the back for a parking place, etc. Now, the question is, of course, why did Katsumi decide to introduce sports and facilities pictograms for wayfinding at the Tokyo Olympics? Partly, this can be attributed to the rising interest in traffic symbols and isotype in Japan, particularly in the period 1959-1962. The earliest to demonstrate this interest were Katsumi and Kamekura, who referred to traffic symbols and isotype in several lectures and articles during this period. A particularly influential publication seems to have been an illustrated abstract of Norred's International Picture Language published in a DAAC journal in 1961. That's a journal of the Japanese Advertising Association. According to design researcher Ihara Hisayasu, who studied the history of isotype in Japan, isotype aided Japanese designers to theoretically and symbolically grasp the subject of pictograms. However, I believe this is only true to a certain degree. Isotype was appreciated particularly as an example of the social role of the designer in making, for example, statistical information clear for the general population. You also had traffic symbols and signage, and I think that provided the conceptual example for wayfinding symbols in particular. Traffic symbols were also discussed at the 1960 World Design Conference in Tokyo by several designers such as Max Huber, Otto Eiche, and Herbert Bayer. This World Design Conference, sponsored by the Japanese government, brought known foreign designers to Japan and enabled Japanese designers to obtain first-hand knowledge about important topics in design, focusing particularly on the contribution that designers could make to society as a whole. In the years thereafter, Katsumi noted a rising interest in visual language among young designers, and it was this generation of designers that Katsumi recruited to be part of his team when he designed the facility symbols. And of course, there's the fact that you had a lot of foreign visitors, which was the main reason. But this is the background to this development. Now about the second question. What was Katsumi's vision for the relay of symbols? Katsumi had a vision about the importance and further development of the Tokyo Olympic pictograms. In 1965, in his article, he proposed to pass on the system of symbols denoting games and sport facilities to designers of future Olympic Games. They could gradually perfect them as a common cultural property on an international scope. Later that year, he wrote that the focus should not only be on extending vocabularies, but also on developing a grammar. For this, he referred to an article that Otto Eiche had written in 1961 about traffic symbols. In this, Eiche explained how subsigns could be combined with other signs to form new meanings. Just like Eiche, Katsumi saw the development of traffic symbols as the first great success in realizing an international symbol language. Now, the idea of this relay of symbols was as the core of Katsumi's vision for pictograms. It assumed the development with a starting point, the Tokyo Olympics, and an endpoint, which at that point was not yet that clear to him. It is also this mission that provided the main thread of symbol development for design historians, with his pictograms being seen as the predecessor of those of Eiche for the Munich Olympics. The Tokyo Olympics created the vocabulary of picture language, Katsumi would write in 1970, and the Munich Olympics will create the grammar. However, close study of his lectures and articles shows that Katsumi wrestled with how the Tokyo Olympic pictograms and his relay idea related to Japanese culture and identity. If you take a look at the history of design, you see that really this whole history of symbols, it's all about universality, modernity, Western society. But of course, Katsumi had his own reflections about this. As many designers and critics of his time, he regarded Japanese society as being dualist in nature, with no clear identity of itself. The Japanese man wears a suit to his office where he sits on a chair, but once he gets home, he will put on his kimono and sit on a tatami mat. That's what Katsumi wrote in the 1950s. Now, if you take a look at graphic design, it was Katsumi who was a strong believer in using tradition as an inspiration to solve this lack of identity, this dualism. Katsumi particularly looked at the Japanese mon, or family crest, that you see here. This had been used in Japan for over a millennium, initially to identify the leading families, but also later to identify citizens, institutions, and businesses. Kamakura saw them as a great example for trademark design. Katsumi, he built on this idea of Kamakura and said, one of the most sophisticated symbols in the world are mons. And he presented pictograms as the successors. Now, this was problematic. This was problematic because, mons are quite static, and he could not use it as an evolutionary model, evolutionary identity model, to explain the relay, the further development of symbols. A much more apt inspiration and comparison was provided by the historic development of writing. In 1966, Katsumi gave a lecture at a conference of the International Council of Graphic Design Associations, Eikergrade in Bled, Yugoslavia. And he started this with a reflection on the nature and value of the Japanese script or writing system. And mind you, this was a lecture specifically about science and development, about pictograms. Now let's take a look at what the Japanese script is. It consisted first of Chinese characters, a partly logographic and partly ideogrammatic system. In addition, you had two phonetic syllabaries called hiragana, that was mainly used for native Japanese words, and katakana, mainly used to write in foreign words. This system found its origins in the 7th century when Japan was extensively influenced by Chinese civilization and took over its writing system, renaming the Chinese characters to kanji. Now, since the Chinese language differed greatly from the Japanese language, they're totally incomparable in grammar and inflections. Hiragana and katakana evolved to compensate for this difference. Differing social classes in Japan used different versions of this Japanese script. The ones used by higher classes and the government were based on knowledge of classical Chinese, so they had to know Chinese language and Chinese characters, signifying erudition and prestige. The ones used by lower classes were based on colloquial Japanese. And this resulted in an incredibly complex script universe that, especially in the 19th century, started to hurt Japan's ability to transform into a modern nation state. Especially in the 1930s, it's quite interesting, Japanese or Chinese characters started to be seen as typically Japanese, strongly tied to Japanese identity and culture. Now, based on his class, education, and interests, Katsumi must have been intimately familiar with all of these concepts and this history. Now, what is interesting for a story about pictograms is what happened after World War II, because that is when there was a major language script reform led by the United States in Japan. United States occupying, redeveloping Japan. And this language reform, script reform was summarized in the slogan, "Our language belongs to all the people, no longer class-based, simplification of Japanese script." Script reform became linked to the implementation of democracy in Japanese society, enabling citizens to inform themselves and participate in political debate. And it is this social motivated desire for a more efficient common language that can also be connected with the earliest interest in isotype in Japan. Now, what was Katsumi's position in this ongoing discussion? Katsumi had mixed feelings about Japan's use of Chinese characters. On the one hand, he viewed China as being stuck in an earlier, more visual stage of script development, the alphabet as being seen more abstract and developed. On the other hand, he concluded that Japan's mixed use of three systems made it flexible enough to adapt to Western civilization and technology. He implied that much might be lost by the use of an alphabet. Interestingly, his whole discussion about Chinese characters can also be linked to Lancelot Hogden and his From Cave Painting to Comic Strip, published in 1949, inspired also partly by NORAD. What Hogden effectively did in this book is taking the example of Japan's script to explain the change from logographic to phonetic scripts. In doing that, Hogden treated Japan like a hinge connecting East and West, which is also how Katsumi actually looked at Japan and its role in the development of pictograms. Katsumi's evaluation of Japan's adaptation of Chinese characters can also be read as an allegory about his expectations for the Western world in regard to pictograms. To him, these seem to be in parallel, these expectations he had. Japan had implemented international traffic symbols in 1946, just like it had taken over Chinese characters. The Japanese were very easy in taking over things from other cultures, was the message. And he contrasted this with the United States' refusal to accept these, in spite of their international interests. The United States had been a promoter of universal values in Japan since World War II. And this refusal to sign and ratify the 1949 International Traffic Symbol Standard of the United Nations was an important sticking point to Katsumi. Actually, he had hoped that in the future, this relay of symbols, that it would result in United Nations, maybe in 1980, 1975, approving this finished symbol relay. But looking now at the behavior of the United States, his hopes were dashed a bit. What he did in his lecture in 1966 was urge also other Western countries' designers not to hurry too much with standardization. They should wait for China to catch up. He viewed it as an ally in his quest for a more Asian representation on the world stage in regard to symbol development. Now, his view was quite typical for many Japanese intellectuals at the time who saw the US as influencing Japanese politics too much. To them, China provided an example of an Asian nation that successfully resisted the West. And what you see then is that around 1970, Katsumi increasingly starts pushing his idea for kanji, Chinese ideogram-based symbol language. As he wrote in Graphies in 1970, my own plan is to combine the function of Chinese characters and the traditional qualities of Japanese family emblems in the construction of international picture signs. Interestingly, he also asked Dreyfuss for feedback on his idea. So what you see here on the screen is a letter from Katsumi to Dreyfuss. They had some exchanges about the Symbol Sourcebook, and he spent considerable time explaining kanji, how this worked, and more or less asking, what do you think of this idea? And Katsumi, he never heard back from Dreyfuss from this. Dreyfuss ignored him. And that's quite a typical reaction. In general, Katsumi's references to Asia were ignored because all international designers were more focused on the standardization idea in Western countries. They didn't take Japan that serious in this regard. Katsumi had hoped that at least Eiger would develop a grammar that he had in mind. In 1969, Eiger had presented an early version of the Munich sports signs in Design Journal print. They were described as a further development of the Tokyo sports pictograms that Eiger found to be constructed unsystematically and claimed to have improved using a syntactic order. In his own writings, Katsumi rephrased this into, Eiger has said that the Tokyo Olympics introduced the vocabulary of picture language and that the Munich Olympics will create the grammar. And he used this in his writings to demonstrate that his relay of pictograms was a success. But when Katsumi finally reviewed the finished pictograms in 1972, he found that the grammar was one of style rather than content. The event symbols have definitely been grammatized in their beauty. That's style, not in function. Many new ones have been added to the vocabulary in the field of the facility symbols. Actually, for Katsumi, everything was about the facility symbols. The sports symbols were, still are, not that important for worldwide communication. Katsumi was right. Eiger failed in his aim to develop a grammar. However, hardly anyone in Western countries read graphic design, and this was lost in history. After 1970, Katsumi withdrew from the international stage. Now, I can say many things in my concluding remarks about the Tokyo Olympic pictograms. Regardless of my somewhat critical introduction, Katsumi single-handedly realized in action and rhetoric the idea of a modern pictogram system as part of a visual identity. However, I feel it's a pity from a more global point of view that as more cultural considerations have been lost, especially from an Asian perspective. And I hope that this lecture, to some degree, makes up for that. And with that, I finish here my talk.